The wedding dress hung in the corner of the bedroom like a ghost I couldn't escape, its ivory fabric catching the moonlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was now supposed to be my bedroom. Our bedroom, though the word ours felt like a lie I'd been forced to learn phonetically without ever understanding its meaning. I stood frozen in the center of the room, still wearing the dress because I hadn't been able to bring myself to move toward the closet, hadn't been able to perform the small intimate act of undressing myself in front of the man who had spoken vows to me approximately 4 hours ago with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a corporate contract. And now, here he was, standing in the doorway with his jacket slung over one arm and his bow tie hanging undone around his neck, looking at me with eyes so devoid of warmth that I wondered if I'd imagined the entire ceremony, or if perhaps I'd stepped into some alternate reality where my father's crushing debt and my family's desperate bargaining had led to this precise moment. Me, in a dress that cost more than my college tuition, staring at a man I didn't know, realizing I never would. His name was Dante Rossi, and he was the kind of beautiful that made you understand why people wrote tragic poetry. The kind of beautiful that came with sharp angles and darker intentions, with a scar running along his jawline that told stories I wasn't sure I wanted to hear, with hands that looked like they'd held both tenderness and violence with equal expertise. And when he finally spoke, after what felt like an eternity of silence so heavy it seemed to press down on my chest with physical weight, his voice was like winter incarnate, like the sound of doors closing and locks turning, and all the warmth in the world being systematically drained away 1 degree at a time. "You are just my wife on paper," he said. And the words hit me with such deliberate coldness that I felt them like a slap, like a door slamming in my face, like every fragile hope I'd constructed during the ceremony came crashing down around my feet in sharp, irretrievable pieces. Don't mistake this for anything else. I had spent the entire day, from the moment my mother adjusted my veil with shaking hands to the moment I walked down that endless aisle on my father's arm, watching his face crumple with a mixture of relief and devastation, building a narrative in my head where this might turn into something other than a transaction, where perhaps proximity and time and the legal binding of our names on a certificate might create something genuine, something real, something that resembled the marriages I'd read about in novels where two people found unexpected connection in forced circumstances. But standing there in that bedroom, with his words still echoing in the space between us like poisonous smoke, I understood that I had been constructing a fantasy in the same way a child builds a sandcastle knowing the tide is coming. It was doomed before it ever began, and my naivete was almost laughable in its desperation. My hands trembled slightly, and I watched my fingers curl into the fabric of my dress as if gripping the material could somehow ground me, could somehow keep me from falling completely apart in front of this man who had just reduced our marriage to its basest elements: business, obligation, nothing more. What made it worse, what made it truly unbearable, was that I could see him watching my reaction with those glacier-cold eyes, observing the way my face tried to process his words, cataloging my devastation the way someone might note the weather, with clinical detachment and absolutely no investment in the outcome. And I realized in that moment that he had constructed walls around himself so thoroughly, so completely, that nothing I could do or say or feel would penetrate them, that he had decided long before I'd walked into his life exactly what I would be to him, and that decision was final, immutable, written in stone and buried deep where no amount of hope or effort could reach it. The marriage certificate was downstairs on a table in his study, I assumed, next to the flowers that had cost thousands of dollars, and the champagne that nobody really wanted to drink. And while I had been up here imagining possibility, he had been establishing parameters, drawing lines that I was not to cross, creating a distance that would be as absolute as the distance between the moon and the earth, as unbridgeable as the space between two people who had stood before witnesses and family, and made promises that now felt like the cruelest joke ever perpetrated. I opened my mouth to speak, though I had no idea what words would possibly be adequate for this situation. What vocabulary existed that could address the specific brand of heartbreak that comes from having your life decided for you, and then watching it be reduced to nothing by someone who couldn't even pretend to care? But before I could form even a single syllable, he moved into the room with the fluid grace of someone utterly assured of their place in the world. And he set his jacket on the back of a chair with deliberate precision, each movement economical and controlled, and he began to undo his cufflinks with the casual grace of someone preparing for bed in any normal marriage, in any situation that didn't feel like standing in the presence of an iceberg that had somehow assumed human form. "There's a suite on the east wing," he said, his voice still carrying that same Arctic quality, still sounding like it was coming from somewhere very far away and very cold. "Your staff has already moved your belongings there. You'll have everything you need. You don't need to be here." And I watched him move toward the bed with such casual dismissal that I felt my breath catch in my throat, because I understood what he was saying beneath the words. You are not needed. You are not wanted. Your presence, in this room, in this space, in this life, is merely a necessity that I will tolerate but never welcome. The walk from his bedroom to the door felt like the longest distance I'd ever traveled, each step feeling heavier than the last. My wedding dress suddenly suffocating against my skin, like it was made of lead instead of silk and tulle. And I moved through the doorway without looking back, because I couldn't bear to see him undressing, couldn't bear the intimacy of witnessing him preparing for sleep as though this night meant nothing, as though his wedding night was like any other night. And I found myself in the hallway of his mansion, which was now, according to the marriage certificate downstairs, my mansion too, though it felt no more like home than standing in the middle of an ice palace, all sharp edges and cold beauty, and no warmth anywhere to be found. My mother had cried when I'd walked down the aisle. My father had looked like he was attending his own funeral. And my younger brother had squeezed my hand so hard before the ceremony that I thought his grip might break my bones. But I had done it. I had sacrificed myself on the altar of my family's survival, because my father had made poor choices and worse enemies, and somehow the responsibility of fixing that had fallen to me, as these things always seem to fall to the women in stories like this. The suite on the East Wing was exactly as I might have expected from a man like Dante Rossi, immaculate and cold and beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, even when they contain no warmth, with furniture that looked like nobody had ever actually sat on it, with a bed covered in expensive linens that still smelled like they'd been newly unwrapped from their packaging, with a view of the grounds that stretched out beneath the moonlight like a kingdom nobody particularly wanted to rule. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still wearing my wedding dress, still wearing my mother's pearl earrings, still wearing the false hope I'd constructed during the ceremony, like a second skin. And I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me, from the part of me that was still young enough to believe that love might be possible, that connection might be achievable, that two people forced together by circumstance might somehow find their way towards something genuine. After exactly 5 minutes, I stopped, because I had always been the kind of person who believed that indulgence in emotion was something I couldn't afford, something that would only weaken me further. And I stood up and I walked to the mirror, and I looked at myself in that wedding dress with tears still wet on my cheeks, and something hardened inside me. Something shifted and locked into place like a door slamming shut, and I made myself a promise. If Dante Rossi wanted a wife on paper, if he wanted someone who would be present but invisible, compliant but emotionless, then that was exactly what he would get. Because I would be damned if I gave him the satisfaction of knowing that his coldness had broken something inside me, that his words had landed exactly where he'd intended them to land, that I was already beginning to understand that surviving this marriage would require me to become someone I didn't recognize. But as I lay in that pristine bed hours later, still wearing the wedding dress because changing out of it felt like admitting defeat, still listening to the silence of the mansion settling around me like snow, I couldn't shake the question that kept circling through my mind like a predator. What had made him so cold? What had transformed a man into someone capable of standing in front of a woman and reducing her to nothing with such practiced ease? And more dangerously, more troublingly, I found myself wondering if perhaps beneath all that ice, beneath all those walls he'd constructed so carefully, there might be something worth finding, someone worth reaching. Because despite everything, despite the cruelty of his words and the absolute dismissal in his eyes, there had been a moment during the ceremony when he'd looked at me, really looked at me, and I'd seen something flicker across his face, something that might have been regret, or might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. And that single moment was enough to lodge itself in my chest like a splinter I couldn't remove, enough to make me dangerous to myself, because I was already beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing a woman can do in a situation like this is to hope. And hope, I was learning, was precisely what I should have been most afraid of. And yet it was the only weapon I had left, the only thing I could hold on to in the darkness that now surrounded me. And so I held it, foolishly, desperately, as the night stretched on and on toward a dawn that suddenly felt very far away. The morning light arrived without mercy, forcing its way through the sheer curtains of my suite with all the subtlety of an unwanted guest, and I woke to the realization that I had actually fallen asleep in my wedding dress, that the delicate ivory fabric was now wrinkled and creased in places that would probably never fully recover, and for a moment, just a brief, fragile moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that small failure before pushing it aside and focusing instead on the monumental task of navigating a day in this house, in this life, as the wife of a man who had made it abundantly clear that my existence was merely an inconvenience he was tolerating. The mansion was still quiet when I finally managed to extract myself from the dress, which seemed to cling to me like it was trying to hold me back from whatever came next, and I stood under a shower that was somehow both luxurious and entirely impersonal. The kind of bathroom that looked like it belonged in a high-end hotel, rather than someone's home, with marble tiles and chrome fixtures and not a single item of a personal nature to suggest that a real human being had ever occupied this space for any reason other than basic biological necessity. My reflection in the mirror afterward showed me a woman I barely recognized, pale and hollow-eyed, with dark circles that no amount of expensive concealer could fully hide, looking like someone who had aged years in the span of a single night. And I thought briefly about calling my mother before deciding against it, because what would I possibly say to her? How could I explain that the sacrifice I'd made had resulted in a level of rejection that went beyond anything I could have imagined? That my husband? And yes, he was my husband now, the word still felt foreign on my tongue, had essentially exiled me to the far reaches of his mansion, like I was some shameful secret he needed to hide away. A woman named Elena appeared at my suite door around mid-morning, introducing herself as the housekeeper with a kind smile that seemed genuinely sympathetic, and she informed me that Signor Rossi had left instructions regarding my daily schedule and expectations, which turned out to be a document, an actual typed document, printed and formal, like something you might find in a corporate office rather than a home, that outlined with remarkable precision exactly what my role would be in this household and in his life. The rules were comprehensive and, in their own way, almost impressive in their thoroughness. I was to take meals in my suite unless attending a formal event that required my presence as his wife, in which case I would be informed with adequate notice so that I could prepare myself appropriately. I was not to venture into certain parts of the mansion, specifically noting his private office, his study, the basement level, and what was referred to only as the East Corridor, with no further explanation. I was not to ask questions about his business dealings or his associates, or the frequent phone calls that I could hear through the walls late at night. Conversations conducted in a mixture of English and Italian that seemed to involve discussions of things I suspected I didn't want to understand. I was to attend to my appearance and maintain the standards expected of a woman in my position, which meant designer clothing purchased from an account that would be established in my name, regular salon appointments to maintain whatever standards Dante apparently had in mind, and a general presentation of being a dutiful, decorative wife when the situation called for it. The document was signed with his name in sharp, controlled handwriting that somehow managed to look both elegant and menacing. And as I read through it, sitting on the edge of my pristine bed in my robe, the wedding dress finally hanging in the closet like a ghost I was trying to forget, I realized that he had essentially created a manual for how to be married to him without actually being married in any meaningful sense, that he had thought through every possible interaction and predetermined exactly how each one should proceed, leaving nothing to chance, nothing to spontaneity, nothing to the unpredictability of human connection. Days began to blur together in a way that I found both comforting and suffocating in equal measure, because there was a strange relief in having such clearly defined boundaries, in knowing exactly what was expected of me, and what would constitute a violation of those expectations, even as there was something deeply soul-crushing about existing in such carefully controlled isolation, eating meals alone in a suite that grew progressively more familiar, and therefore progressively more like a cage. I began to explore the mansion systematically, moving through the corridors and rooms that were available to me, familiarizing myself with the layout of what was apparently now my home, noting the expensive art on the walls and the carefully curated furniture and the general atmosphere of wealth that seemed to emphasize aesthetics above all else, above comfort, above any sense of lived-in domesticity. The library became my refuge, because it was a space that seemed less calculated than the rest of the house, with shelves that actually showed signs of being used, books that had been read multiple times based on the worn spines and dog-eared pages, and I would spend hours there during the day, moving through novels and poetry collections and non-fiction works on subjects ranging from history to psychology to philosophy, trying to lose myself in other people's stories because my own story had become far too painful to contemplate directly. It was in the library that I first realized the house wasn't quite as empty as it seemed. There were other people here, staff members who moved through the corridors with practiced invisibility, who appeared when needed and disappeared when not, who looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and carefully neutral professionalism that suggested they understood my situation far better than I might have liked them to. 3 weeks into my marriage, though marriage still felt like the wrong word for whatever arrangement this actually was, I encountered Dante in person for the first time since that first night, and the encounter happened by accident, which somehow made it worse, because accident implied a lack of control, implied that perhaps he hadn't been avoiding me with the same deliberate intention that I'd been avoiding him, or perhaps it meant the opposite. Perhaps it meant that he'd been so thoroughly unbothered by my existence that he hadn't given a single thought to ensuring our paths didn't cross. I was in the library, as I always was in the late afternoon, when the light came through the windows in that particular golden way that made reading possible without turning on the artificial lights, and I was so absorbed in a novel, something by Dostoevsky, appropriately enough, given that my own life seemed to be developing all the tragic hallmarks of 19th century Russian literature, that I didn't notice him enter until he was already in the room, already moving toward the shelves on the far wall with the casual ownership of someone who belonged in every space he occupied. He was on the phone, speaking in Italian in that low, dangerous voice that I'd heard occasionally through the walls late at night, his tone carrying all the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately and without question. And he was saying something about percentages and territories and names that sounded vaguely threatening, even though I didn't understand the specific context. And he seemed entirely unaware that I was there until he turned and found me watching him, found me caught in the act of staring at him like some kind of infatuated idiot. And for a moment, just a single, crystalline moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been surprise or might have been something else, something darker and more complex that I couldn't begin to interpret. He finished his phone call without breaking eye contact with me, which felt like an assertion of dominance, a demonstration that my presence was not significant enough to warrant any shift in his priorities or his attention. And he set the phone down on the desk with deliberate precision before acknowledging me with a slight incline of his head. a gesture so minimal that it barely qualified as a greeting, but that somehow felt like an olive branch extended from across an unbridgeable chasm. "You've been exploring," he said, and it wasn't a question, it was an observation, stated in that same controlled voice that I'd come to understand was his baseline, that Arctic tone that he used even when discussing relatively neutral topics, as if warmth in his speech was a luxury he'd decided long ago that he couldn't afford. His eyes, and I had now spent enough time in proximity to him to notice that his eyes were not actually purely cold, but rather a complex shade of dark gray, with hints of green, like storm clouds over troubled water, tracked across the shelves and then back to me. And I found myself taking inventory of his appearance almost against my will. He was wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly budget before the marriage, the jacket draped over a chair near the desk, his sleeves rolled up to expose forearms that were marked with scars I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps I had noticed them and simply hadn't processed them, and his hair was slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, a sign of stress or frustration that somehow made him seem slightly more human than the perfectly controlled version of himself that I'd encountered on our wedding night. "I'm trying to understand the layout," I found myself saying, which was technically true but also inadequate as an explanation for why I'd essentially memorized the location of every book in this library, for why I'd begun leaving marks on pages that contained passages I found particularly moving, for why I'd started coming here not just for the books, but for the whisper of possibility that perhaps this was a space where he actually spent time, where I might accidentally encounter evidence of the person he'd been before whatever had turned him into stone. He was quiet for a long moment, and during that silence I could hear the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the mansion, could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street outside the gates that surrounded this place, could hear my own heartbeat, which seemed absurdly loud given that we were standing in relative silence. And when he finally spoke again, his voice seemed to carry a note of something I couldn't quite identify, something that might have been curiosity, or might have been concern, or might have been nothing at all, and I was simply projecting meaning onto his tone because I was desperate enough to find meaning in anything, even the way he delivered his next sentence. "The house has a lot of history," he said, and he reached toward one of the shelves and pulled down a book with a leather binding that had clearly been read many times, opening it to reveal not text but photographs, images of the mansion as it had been decades ago, and he found a particular page and showed it to me. A photo of a woman with dark hair and eyes that held warmth in them, eyes that seemed to contain actual life and joy and possibility, standing in front of a fountain in what looked like the mansion's front courtyard. "My mother loved this room," he continued, his voice dropping slightly lower, taking on a quality that suggested he was perhaps speaking more to himself than to me. "She used to spend entire afternoons here reading. She believed that books were the only escape from a world that was determined to crush you into conformity and submission." The revelation hung in the air between us like something fragile that might shatter if either of us moved too suddenly, and I found myself understanding something crucial in that moment. That his coldness wasn't simply a character trait, wasn't simply the personality of someone naturally inclined toward emotional distance, but rather was something he'd constructed deliberately, something he'd built as a response to something, that perhaps his walls weren't meant to keep me out so much as they were meant to keep something in, to contain some part of himself that he deemed too dangerous to allow into the world. He set the book down on the table next to me without meeting my eyes again, and he turned toward the door with the same economical grace he brought to every movement. And just before leaving, he said something quietly, almost as an afterthought. "You can spend time here whenever you want." She would have liked that, someone actually using the space instead of letting it gather dust. And then he was gone, moving back out into the hallway, and I was left alone with the photograph of a woman with warm eyes and the disconcerting realization that perhaps the man I'd married wasn't emotionally incapable of connection, but rather was someone who had been so thoroughly devastated by loss that he'd decided connection itself was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. And I found myself wondering, with a mixture of hope and dread that I immediately recognized as dangerous, whether it was possible to reach someone who had built their walls so high, or whether attempting to do so would only result in my own destruction. And yet I knew, even as I stood there with the photograph still in my hands, that I was already beginning to try, already beginning to let hope take root in the cracks of my own resolve, already beginning to become the kind of woman who would risk everything for the possibility of reaching someone who had made it clear they didn't want to be reached. The fever came without warning on a Tuesday evening, arriving like an uninvited guest that settled into my bones and refused to leave. And I spent the night in my suite, moving between the bed and the bathroom in a haze of confusion and discomfort, my body burning from the inside while I shivered under layers of blankets. And I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness, experiencing strange, fractured dreams where Dante's face would appear and then dissolve, where he was saying something urgent that I couldn't quite hear. And when I finally woke in the pale light of early morning, I realized that I was soaked through with sweat, that my throat felt like I'd been swallowing shards of glass, and that the simple act of sitting up required an enormous amount of energy that I seemed to have completely exhausted. I tried to reach for my phone to call one of the staff members, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't manage it. And I lay back against the pillows feeling genuinely frightened because I'd never been this sick before, had never experienced my body completely failing me in this way. And there was something terrifying about being ill in a house where you knew nobody, where you had no one to care whether you survived the night or not, where the person you were technically closest to had made it abundantly clear that your well-being was of no concern to him whatsoever. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, and I drifted in and out of a kind of delirium where my mother's voice seemed to be calling to me from very far away, where I could hear my father's worried murmurs. And I remember thinking, in the way you do when fever has destroyed your ability to think coherently, that if I died here, in this beautiful prison of a mansion, there would be a certain poetic irony to it, that my sacrifice would have been for nothing, that my family's debt would somehow remain unpaid while I remained permanently indebted to a man who saw me as nothing more than a transaction that had already been completed. I was vaguely aware of someone entering the room, the sound of the door opening, the rush of cooler air from the hallway, footsteps that seemed to cross the space between the door and my bed with urgent purpose. But I couldn't focus enough to determine who it was, couldn't manage more than a weak attempt to open my eyes. And then I felt a hand on my forehead, cool and steady and somehow grounding in a way that penetrated even through the fog of fever and confusion. And when I finally managed to force my eyes open, I found myself looking directly into Dante's face, which was positioned so close to mine that I could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes, could see the sharp line of his jaw, could see concern written across his features in a way that seemed almost impossible given everything he'd demonstrated about his capacity for emotional detachment. "How long have you been like this?" he demanded, his voice carrying an edge that suggested anger rather than compassion, though I was too fevered to determine exactly what the anger was directed at. Whether it was aimed at me for being sick, at himself for finding me in this condition, or at some combination of circumstances that he was apparently assigning blame for. I tried to answer him, tried to form words that would explain that I'd woken up this way, that I hadn't wanted to impose on anyone, that I'd been trying to manage on my own because that's what I did, that's what I'd always done. But my voice came out as nothing more than a rasp, and he seemed to recognize that speaking was beyond my current capabilities, because he stood up abruptly, and I heard him speaking in rapid Italian into his phone, words tumbling out too quickly for me to follow. And I caught fragments. "Doctor, fever, now." And then he was back, moving with a kind of controlled urgency that suggested he knew exactly what needed to be done, and he was adjusting the pillows beneath my head, his movements surprisingly gentle given the hardness of his expression, and he brought a washcloth that he'd apparently soaked in cool water and pressed it against my forehead with a care that seemed incongruous with the man I'd been living in fear of for the past month. Time became even more fragmented after that, And I remember the doctor arriving, an older man with kind eyes who seemed entirely unsurprised to find the notorious Dante Rossi hovering protectively over a feverish woman in an upstairs bedroom. And I remember being poked and prodded while Dante stood off to the side with his arms crossed, watching the examination with the intensity of someone who believed that sheer force of will could control the outcome of medical situations. And the doctor's pronouncement that I had a serious influenza that would need to run its course, that I needed rest and fluids and monitoring. And then I remember Dante's response, his quiet voice saying, "I'll monitor her," in a tone that suggested that this was not a matter up for discussion, that he had apparently decided I was now his responsibility, and that he would be taking on that responsibility regardless of anyone's objections, including my own. The next several days blurred together into a strange kind of intimacy that I might have found romantic under completely different circumstances, but which instead felt surreal given the nature of our relationship. Given that he'd spent the past month treating me with the emotional warmth of someone dealing with an inanimate object. And yet here he was, sitting beside my bed for hours at a time, reading in that chair positioned near the window. And whenever my fever would spike, he would appear at my side with the cool washcloths, would help me sit up enough to drink water or broth, would change the sweat-soaked sheets with a kind of competent efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, had cared for someone through illness in a way that felt practiced and real. I remember fragments of fever dreams where he would sit on the edge of my bed and speak to me in Italian, his voice low and almost hypnotic. And I would catch words that I would later realize meant, "Forgive me." Words that seemed to be directed not at me but at some memory. Some ghost of a woman who I was beginning to understand had occupied a significant space in his life before I arrived. On the fourth night, or perhaps it was the fifth, I'd lost count. My fever finally broke, and I woke to find myself drenched in sweat, but finally clear-headed for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and I realized that Dante was asleep in the chair beside my bed, his head tilted back at an angle that would definitely cause him neck pain when he woke. His face softened in sleep in a way that made him look almost vulnerable, almost human in a way that his waking self seemed determined never to appear. I must have made some sound, some small movement that disturbed him, because his eyes snapped open immediately. That's the kind of sleep deprivation and hypervigilance that comes from a life of danger, I realized. And for a moment he looked disoriented. Looked like something in him broke open just slightly before he managed to reassemble the walls that he usually kept so firmly in place. "You're awake," he said. And there was something in his voice that sounded almost relieved, as if he'd been worried that my fever might have taken a turn for the worse, that perhaps he'd been sitting there for days, anticipating some kind of medical crisis that he couldn't prevent through sheer force of will. And I found myself marveling at how different he looked in the morning light, coming through the windows. How the careful control that usually characterized his expression seemed to slip occasionally when he was tired, when he was operating on minimal sleep and genuine concern. "You've been here the whole time?" I asked, my voice rough, from disuse and illness. And he nodded without elaboration. And then he stood up and moved toward the bathroom and returned with a fresh washcloth and a glass of water, and he helped me sit up slightly so that I could drink, his hand warm against my back. And I found myself thinking that this moment, this simple, intimate moment of being cared for by someone I barely knew, was perhaps the most real connection I'd experienced since arriving in this house. More real than the wedding. More real than any of the careful interactions that had come before. "You were calling for your mother," he said suddenly, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it. Something that suggested he'd been listening to my fevered cries, had been present for all the moments when my guard was completely down, when I'd been too delirious to maintain any pretense of control or dignity. "And at one point you apologized repeatedly. You kept saying you were sorry, that you didn't want to be a burden. You need to stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault." His voice had shifted again, back toward that familiar hardness. But there was something different underneath it now, something that sounded almost like tenderness wrapped in steel, and I realized that he was trying to protect himself by retreating back into coldness, was trying to establish distance again after the vulnerability of having cared for me through illness, after having allowed me to see him in a state of concern that probably felt dangerous to him. When he moved toward the door, and I could sense that he was about to leave, was about to return me to isolation now that the crisis had passed, now that he could reasonably withdraw from the intimate responsibility he'd assumed, I found myself reaching out and catching his wrist, surprising both of us with the gesture. And I said, "Thank you," because those seemed like the only words adequate to express the complexity of what his care had meant, the way it had cracked something open in my understanding of him, the way it had suggested that perhaps beneath all the ice there was something human, something capable of genuine feeling, something that might be worth trying to reach. He looked down at where my hand was touching his wrist, and his expression shifted in a way that was difficult to interpret, something flickering across his features that might have been regret, or might have been fear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're dangerous," he said, and the words hit me with an impact that the fever hadn't managed, because I understood what he meant, understood that he was saying I was dangerous to the walls he'd constructed, that caring for me through illness had somehow compromised his carefully maintained emotional distance, that perhaps his fear wasn't that I would hurt him, but that he might hurt me by allowing himself to feel things that he'd decided long ago were too risky to feel. "Don't make me feel things I swore I wouldn't feel again," he continued, and there was genuine anguish in his voice, genuine terror at the possibility of vulnerability. And then he pulled his wrist free from my grip and left the room, and I was left there in the pale morning light, understanding for the first time that the coldness wasn't just armor protecting me from him, but armor protecting him from himself, that he was as much a prisoner of this marriage as I was, and that perhaps the greatest danger we both faced wasn't each other, but the possibility that we might actually find something real together, despite all the reasons we'd been given to believe that was impossible. Recovery from the fever was slow, incremental, marked by days where I regained a little more strength, where I could sit up without assistance and eventually stand for brief periods. And during those days of convalescence, I found myself replaying his words over and over in my mind like a song I couldn't shake, turning them over and examining them from every possible angle, analyzing his admission that I was dangerous to him the way a scholar might analyze a text, looking for hidden meanings and subtext, trying to determine whether his fear was something I should respect by maintaining distance or whether it was actually an opening, a crack in the wall that I might be able to use to reach the human being I now knew existed somewhere beneath all that carefully constructed coldness. The mansion had taken on a different feeling during my illness and recovery, or perhaps I had changed in some fundamental way that made me perceive it differently, and I began to notice things I'd been too wrapped up in my own isolation to see before. The way Dante moved through the corridors with a kind of controlled tension, as if his body was continuously at war with itself. The way he would appear in the library exactly when I'd managed to convince myself that I'd imagined the connection between us, as if he was drawn there by forces he couldn't control. The way his eyes would track toward me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, watching me with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve some kind of puzzle that I represented. 2 weeks after my fever broke, I was recovering in my suite when I decided, with the kind of reckless certainty that comes from understanding you have nothing left to lose, that I was finished with this arrangement of careful distance and polite isolation, that I was done accepting the walls he'd built, and I put on a dress that I'd purchased during one of the salon appointments Elena had arranged, a dress in deep emerald that the stylist had assured me would bring out my eyes, and I wore it not because Dante had requested that I dress for dinner, not because there was any formal occasion requiring it, but because I needed him to see me. Really see me. Not as the dutiful wife on paper, but as the woman I actually was underneath all the fear and resignation. I found him, in his office, which was technically off limits, according to the original document he'd given me. But I'd decided that rules established from a place of such profound emotional denial no longer held any power over my actions, and he was standing behind his desk with the phone pressed to his ear, speaking in that rapid Italian that I'd begun to understand better through simple exposure. And when he saw me standing in his doorway, his expression shifted through several stages. Surprise, then something that looked almost like anger, then a kind of resignation that suggested he understood that I was finally pushing back against the boundaries he'd tried to establish. He finished his call without taking his eyes off me, his gaze traveling from my face down the length of the dress and then back again, and I could see his jaw clench, could see his hands tighten into fists on the desk surface. And when he finally spoke, his voice had taken on that dangerous quality that suggested he was barely maintaining control over something dark and powerful that lived beneath his skin. "What are you doing?" he asked, and the question seemed to encompass far more than just my presence in his office or the dress I was wearing. It seemed to be asking me what I was doing to him, what I was doing to the careful architecture of emotional avoidance that he'd constructed, what I was doing by continuing to exist in his space in a way that defied his attempts to compartmentalize me into manageable categories. "You need to leave," he said. But his voice lacked conviction, lacked the actual authority that would have made it a command I felt obligated to obey, and instead it sounded more like a warning directed perhaps more at himself than at me, a warning that if I didn't leave immediately, something was going to happen that he'd been desperately trying to prevent. I didn't leave, and I think on some level he'd known I wouldn't, because I was tired of leaving. Tired of respecting boundaries that were only meant to protect him from feeling anything real. And I moved further into the room instead, moving around his desk with a deliberate slowness that I could see was causing him physical tension, could see his shoulders becoming increasingly rigid, could see his breath becoming shallower as I drew closer to where he stood, frozen in place like something caught between two equally unacceptable options. "You said I was dangerous," I told him, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt, sounded like it belonged to someone who had some sense of certainty when in fact, I was terrified, absolutely terrified of what this confrontation might mean, of how he might respond, of whether I was misinterpreting the signals he'd been sending me, or whether I was reading them correctly. And he truly was as trapped by his feelings as I was by mine. "You said I was dangerous because I make you feel things. But I think you're dangerous too, Dante. I think you're dangerous because so determined not to feel anything that you're slowly destroying yourself from the inside, and you're trying to destroy anyone who gets close enough to see what's happening." I was close to him now, close enough that I could see the pulse point in his neck, close enough to see the war happening behind his eyes, and I knew that I was either about to experience the greatest rejection of my life, or I was about to finally break through the walls that had been between us since that first cold night in his bedroom. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, not roughly, but with enough force to make clear that he was fighting against something, fighting against himself. And for a moment I thought he was going to throw me out of his office, was going to reassert the boundaries I'd violated. But instead he pulled me closer, and his other hand came up to my face, his fingers tracing my jawline with a touch so gentle it was almost unbearable, and he said my name. He said my name for the first time since the wedding, speaking it like it was something sacred, something dangerous, something he'd been afraid to say out loud because saying it might make me reel in a way that was too terrifying to contemplate. "Don't do this," he whispered, and there was genuine desperation in his voice, genuine fear. And I realized that his walls weren't there because he didn't feel things, but because he felt things so intensely that the fear of losing them had become unbearable, that he'd rather exist in emotional numbness than risk the kind of devastation that came from opening yourself up to another person. "Don't do this because I don't know how to handle this. I don't know how to be what you need me to be. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've made myself into." But even as he was saying these things, Even as he was trying to push me away with his words, his hands were pulling me closer. And then he kissed me. And it was nothing like I'd imagined it would be. It was violent and desperate and filled with years of suppressed longing, and I could taste something on his lips that might have been tears, or might have been whiskey, or might have been something else entirely. Something that spoke to the depth of what he'd been holding back. The kiss broke apart, and he rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged and uneven, and he said, "You don't understand what you're asking for. You don't understand what I am, what I've done, the things I'm capable of. If you let me in, if you let yourself care about me, I will destroy you. That's what I do. I take things that are beautiful and I destroy them. That's my nature." And I heard the truth in his words, heard the genuine self-knowledge and self-condemnation. But I also heard something else. I heard a man who had been so thoroughly convinced of his own monstrosity that he'd stopped believing he could be anything else. And I understood in that moment that I had a choice to make, that I could either accept his version of himself as truth or I could challenge it, and I chose the latter, even though it terrified me, even though I had no guarantee it would work out, even though every rational part of my brain was screaming at me that I was making a mistake. "Then we'll destroy each other," I said, and I pulled his mouth back to mine. And this kiss was different, was filled with acceptance rather than desperation, with choice rather than capitulation. And when he finally pulled back, his expression had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, something that looked like a man who had been drowning and had finally been pulled to the surface. And he whispered something in Italian that I didn't understand, but that sounded like a prayer. He carried me, and there was something almost tender about the way he did it, the way he held me like I was something precious that might shatter if he wasn't careful. And he moved out of his office and toward the main staircase, and I could feel the weight of the house around us, the awareness that staff members might be watching, that we were violating the careful social structure he'd established. But he didn't seem to care anymore, seemed to have reached some kind of breaking point where the maintenance of appearance was no longer worth the cost of continuing to deny what he was feeling. His bedroom was exactly as austere as I'd remembered it from that first night, but it felt different now, felt like a space that was finally coming alive. And he set me down on the bed with care before pulling back to look at me. Really look at me, with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I'd never felt before, that made me understand that he was committing me to memory, was imprinting me onto his consciousness, was making some kind of internal vow that I couldn't quite articulate, but could definitely feel. "Tell me if I hurt you," he said, and his voice had taken on that ragged quality again, that tone of someone barely holding on to control. And I nodded because I couldn't seem to find words adequate to the moment. And then he was kissing me again, and his hands were moving across my body with a kind of reverent desperation. And somewhere in the middle of everything, in the middle of the intensity and the passion and the overwhelming sensation of finally being touched by this man who had kept himself at such a careful distance, I realized that the first night hadn't broken his control in the way the title of our story had suggested, but rather this moment where he finally allowed himself to feel something real, was the moment where everything changed, was the moment where the walls came down and he became fully human again, was the moment where we stopped being strangers forced together by circumstance and became something else entirely, something that felt dangerous and fragile and absolutely worth the risk we were both taking. But even as I was experiencing this moment of connection, even as I was losing myself in the sensation of finally being wanted by him, finally mattering to someone who I'd believed was incapable of caring about anything, I heard it in the distance. The sound of his phone buzzing repeatedly on the nightstand, the insistent vibration of messages accumulating, and I could feel something shift in his body, could feel him becoming aware of the outside world attempting to reclaim his attention. And when he finally pulled back to check the phone, I could see the color drain from his face, could see something dark and dangerous settle back over his expression, and he whispered a curse in Italian before looking back at me with an expression that contained all the dread of a man who understood that the moment of peace we'd found was about to be shattered by the realities of the world he inhabited. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice had shifted back toward that cold, controlled tone, but underneath it I could hear genuine fear. Fear not for himself, but for me. Fear that the enemies he'd made in his rise to power had somehow discovered that he had a weakness now, that he had something, someone, that could be used against him. And I felt the warmth of the moment begin to fade as I realized that the night that had changed everything between us had also painted a target on my back, that by giving him something to lose, I had become the very thing he'd been most terrified of. And I understood with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be simple between us again. The next morning arrived with the kind of darkness that comes from understanding that the fragile peace you've constructed is built on a foundation of sand. And I woke to find Dante already gone from the bed, already moved back into whatever compartment of his life involved threats and strategy and the ruthless calculus of survival in a world where showing vulnerability was essentially a death sentence. And I lay there for several minutes just breathing, trying to hold on to the feeling of last night, while simultaneously preparing myself for whatever was about to unfold. Whatever threat had emerged from the shadows to shatter the moment we'd stolen from the chaos that surrounded us. The message had come from his associates, something about a rival family discovering that he had what they were calling a liability, which was apparently me. Apparently the fact that I mattered to him had somehow made its way through the network of criminals and informants that permeated the underworld he inhabited. And the realization that I had become a target simply by allowing myself to be loved was almost more terrifying than the actual threat itself, because it meant that my presence in his life would always be dangerous, that every moment of connection we managed to forge would come at the cost of increased risk, that loving him would essentially require me to accept a level of danger that most people would consider completely unacceptable. I found him in his office, again, this time flanked by 3 men in dark suits who looked like they'd been carved from the same piece of granite. Men with the kind of cold competence in their eyes that suggested they'd done terrible things and had long ago made peace with that fact. And when I entered, Dante's first instinct was to shield me, was to position himself between me and the other men, as if his body could actually block the reality of the threat they represented. And one of the men, older, with silver hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, allowed himself a thin smile at the sight of him protecting me, as if this confirmation of his weakness was exactly what they'd been hoping to find. "We have a proposition," the scarred man said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having his words carry actual consequences, and he explained, with a kind of casual cruelty, that the rival family was willing to let this whole matter drop if Dante was willing to cede territory, was willing to diminish his power base, was willing to essentially castrate himself as a player in the world he'd worked so hard to dominate. Or alternatively, they could simply remove the liability, remove me, and everything could continue as it had been, with no loss of territory, no loss of face, just the simple elimination of the problem that I represented. I watched Dante's hands clench into fists, watched his entire body go rigid with the effort of maintaining control, watched him struggle with a choice that no human being should ever have to make. And I realized in that moment that I had been naive in my hope, naive in my belief that love could conquer the fundamental realities of his world, naive in thinking that 2 people could simply decide to have something real when the circumstances surrounding them were so fundamentally designed to prevent that. And I made a decision right there in that office, surrounded by dangerous men and the smell of expensive cologne and threat, that I wouldn't let him sacrifice his empire for me, wouldn't be the reason he lost everything, wouldn't become the weakness that defined him, because I understood now that his power wasn't just about money and territory. It was about the one thing in his world that couldn't be taken away as long as he remained strong. And if he weakened himself trying to protect me, then we'd both be vulnerable. and the danger wouldn't diminish. It would only multiply. "Let me propose something different," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Sounded like it belonged to someone who actually had some authority in a room full of dangerous people. And I laid out a plan that had formed in my mind in the space of a few heartbeats. A plan that involved me being removed from the city, being placed under protection in a location known only to Dante, and the spreading of rumors that we'd separated, that our marriage was failing, that I was no longer of significance to him, and that this was simply a consequence of him finally ridding himself of the weakness he'd allowed to develop, essentially recreating the version of himself that had been so formidable before I arrived, so that his enemies would have no reason to pursue me because I would no longer be connected to him in any meaningful way. The scarred man seemed almost impressed by this proposal, seemed to recognize that it came from a place of genuine love and sacrifice, rather than from a desire to protect myself. And Dante looked at me like I'd physically stabbed him, looked at me with an expression of such profound anguish and protest that I had to turn away because I couldn't bear to see the pain I was causing him, even though I was doing it to save him, even though I was doing it for reasons that I hoped he would eventually come to understand, even though every part of me was screaming to take it back, to choose the version of this story where we fought together rather than the version where I disappeared. But I didn't take it back, and instead I left that office and I packed a single bag, and I allowed myself to be escorted by one of Dante's most trusted men, a woman named Lucia, who had the kind of competent grace that suggested she'd spent her entire life helping other women escape impossible situations, to a house on the coast, several hours' drive away, in a town where nobody knew my face, where nobody knew who Dante Rossi was, where I could theoretically begin the process of becoming someone else, someone without the weight of his world pressing down on them. The separation was performed with theatrical precision for public consumption. Rumors were planted about our incompatibility, about how the marriage had been a failure, about how Dante had finally decided that having a wife was an unnecessary complication in his life, and I watched from my isolated location as the narrative took hold, as my marriage began to dissolve in the eyes of the world, and as Dante, my Dante, the man who had finally allowed himself to feel something real, retreated back into coldness, back into the person he'd been before I crashed into his life and forced him to confront his own capacity for human connection. 3 months passed, or perhaps it was 4. Time moved strangely in that coastal house where I existed in a kind of limbo, not quite free because I was still bound to Dante through the sacrifice I'd made, not quite prisoner because Lucia ensured that I had whatever I needed. And during those months I did something I hadn't done since arriving in his mansion. I actually read the books I'd been collecting, actually finished novels and poetry collections, actually allowed myself to process the emotions of separation by channeling them into other stories, other people's narratives, trying to understand whether my sacrifice had been noble or whether it had simply been another version of the imprisonment I'd been trying to escape. Letters came occasionally, delivered by Lucia with a kind of reverent care that suggested their importance. Letters written in Dante's sharp handwriting. Letters that started out formal and distant, but gradually became more personal, more vulnerable, more filled with the kind of raw emotion that he usually kept so carefully locked away. And in those letters he told me about the emptiness of having his power back, about the hollowness of having his empire intact when the person he wanted to rule beside him was no longer there, about how he'd finally understood what his mother had meant when she'd said that some escapes required you to leave behind everything you thought mattered, and that real freedom came not from controlling your circumstances, but from being willing to lose control, from being willing to surrender to something larger than yourself. The final letter arrived on a day when the weather had shifted, when the coast had transformed from summer brightness into autumn's more melancholic palette, and in it he told me that he'd made a decision, that he was dismantling his empire, piece by piece, systematically transferring power to trusted associates, deliberately making himself less of a target, less of a threat, less of everything that had defined him before I arrived, And he was doing it not because I'd asked him to, not because he was trying to prove something to me, but because he'd realized that real power, true power, came not from controlling others but from controlling himself, from being willing to choose something uncertain and terrifying over the comfortable prison of emotional isolation. He was coming for me, he wrote, and he would understand if I didn't want to see him, if I'd spent the months of separation deciding that I was better off alone, that loving him wasn't worth the complications and dangers that came with it. But he wanted me to know that he'd finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him that night in his office, that loving someone required you to be willing to lose everything, and that he was ready now to make that sacrifice, to choose me over everything else, to become the kind of man who could actually sustain a real relationship, rather than just performing the motions of one. He arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon, and I watched from the window as his car pulled up, a simple black sedan rather than the ostentatious vehicle he usually traveled in, and he got out moving like someone who was uncertain of his welcome, but willing to face rejection if that was what I needed. And when I opened the door to let him in, I saw that he looked different somehow, lighter maybe, or perhaps just more genuinely human, as if removing the weight of his empire had released something in him that had been compressed for years. And we stood there looking at each other across the threshold of that small house. And neither of us spoke for a long moment because what was there to say? How could words possibly encompass the journey we'd taken from that first cold night in his bedroom to this moment of genuine vulnerability and acceptance? "I still don't know how to do this," he said finally, and his voice contained none of the coldness that had once defined him, contained instead a rawness and honesty that suggested he'd finally given up trying to be someone other than what he actually was. "I still don't know how to be the man you deserve, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to try. I'm willing to fail and try again as many times as it takes." And I pulled him inside, and we held each other like two people who had survived something catastrophic and emerged on the other side. And I realized that the title of our story, "You Are Just My Wife on Paper," had been true once, had been the absolute truth of our situation at a specific moment in time. But that moment had transformed into something else entirely, something that existed in the space between paper and permanence, in the space between fear and faith, in the space between the people we'd been forced to be and the people we'd chosen to become. We didn't have a fairy tale ending, because this world doesn't offer fairy tales to people like us. But we had something that seemed more valuable. We had the understanding that love required constant choice, constant willingness to be vulnerable, constant acceptance that the person you were choosing might hurt you, and that you were choosing them anyway. And we had the hard-won knowledge that the walls people build are never actually meant to keep others out, but rather to keep themselves in, to contain the pain and fear and capacity for devastation that comes with being human, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop building walls and instead choose to let someone in, knowing that it might destroy you, choosing it anyway, because the alternative, a life lived in isolation and control, was a slower, more insidious form of destruction. As I lay beside him that night in that small house on the coast, listening to him sleep the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that I suspected he hadn't experienced in years, I whispered a final thought into the darkness. He said I was just his wife on paper, and he was right. For a moment, I was only paper, only ink, only a transaction recorded in legal documents. But that night when he finally broke, when he finally allowed himself to feel, when he finally chose vulnerability over control, that was when our story became real. When we stopped existing in theory and started existing in practice, when the spaces between us filled with something that no document could ever capture, something that would define the rest of our lives together. And I would spend forever grateful that he was finally brave enough to let the paper burn.